Hope everyone had a wonderful Purim. And we started learning about the Kevesh. And this is number Yud Zion. I wanted to just point out something that we missed last time about the Kevesh. And this is based on a footnote here in Samach Beis, quoting a Sugya in Eruvin. And the Gemara in Eruvin speaks about salting the ground of the Kevesh on Shabbos. And those who are with me for the Daf Yomi, for Eruvin, you may remember this sugya. All the sugyas at the end of Eruvin are about the principle of Ein Shvus B'Migdash. And the question is whether salting the Kevesh on Shabbos so that the Kohanim don't slip on the wet ground, is that a violation of a Shvus, and therefore it's mutter on Shabbos, or is it a Doraisa? And with regard to Malach Doraisa, there's no difference between Migdash and Medina. And the Gemara says it depends. Does he intend to be Mavatel the Melach on the Kevesh? Meaning, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that he leaves the salt there and it simply dissolves and dries up the surface of the Kevesh. The other possibility is that he very quickly cleans out the melach and disposes of it. So the Gemara actually says, Mimonavsha. Either way, we're in trouble. Even with vatel some melach, legabi kevesh, then it's considered part and parcel of the kevesh. And that's called being mosif ala binyan. And hosafa ala binyan is meleches binyan. If you expand by flattening out the ground of a pre-existing building, a structure, you are in violation of meleches boneh. And being mosif ala binyan would be also even in the Beis HaMikdash. And we couldn't apply the principle of Ein Shvus B'Migdash. And the Gemara says, V'im lo hayim mevatlo, meaning it's not that he's leaving the salt on a permanent basis, and therefore the salt is not part of the Kevesh and the Mizbeach, is then the Melach should be a chatzitza between the Raglei HaKohanim and the Kevesh. Because the Kohanim have to go barefoot in the Azorah and up the Kevesh until they do the Zrikas Adam. Well, the salt on the floor of the Kevesh, that will be a hefsek, will be a chatzitza between the Raglei HaKohanim and the Kevesh. And the Gemara is so impressed by this Mimonav Shach, that the Gemara comes to the conclusion that even though we're talking about a situation of salting the kevesh, and we intend to clean off the kevesh of its salt, and therefore there's no malach doraisa being mosif al ha binyan because he's not intending to be mavatel the melach to the kevesh, but nevertheless there's no problem of chatzitza. Why? Because the Gemara says that when it says in the Mishnah that we do this salting process on the kevesh on Shabbos, it's referring to a case of shas holachas ha'etzim, when they are carrying the eitzim up the kevesh to place them on the marach on the top of the mizbeach, and the Gemara says that holachas ha'etzim is not considered an avoda, and it doesn't require Kohanim, and therefore if the Kohanim are wearing shoes, but that they're not going to wear shoes, but they are stepping on the salt, and they don't have direct contact between their feet and the kevesh, it's no problem, because this halacha that there cannot be a chatzitza only applies to an avoda, and halachas ha'etzim is not an avoda. That is a summary of an entire sugya at the end of a Masechta Eruv. Now, until this point, we've been discussing the Kevesh Limizbeach. And we spoke about the various midos, the size. It's 32 amos to go from the foot of the kevesh up the ramp until you reach the Mizbeach. All right, we spoke about the width. It's 16 amos wide. It's a very impressive structure, this kevesh. But what we also have to point out is that the kevesh is multifunctional. It serves the Kohanim not just when they have to get all the way up to the top of the Mizbeach, but it also serves the Kohanim for something that's called Malikas Olas Ha'of. Now, in the case of a carbon Olas Ha'of, we have a unique kind of avoda, which is done on the Keren Mizrachis Dromis of what? Of the Sovev. Now, if you recall, the structure of the Mizbeach goes up from the Yisod to the Sovev until finally we reach the top of the Mizbeach. In each section, as we spoke about at great length, you require Ribua. But what avoda is served by the Sovev? In other words, what's the goal of the Sovev? And that's called Malikas Ha'of. So the Malikas Ha'of, which, as we said before, is on the Mizrachis Dromis section of the Mizbeach, is achieved when the Kohen climbs up the Sovev to get to the Sovev. What does he climb to get to the Sovev? Well, guess what? He doesn't climb the Kevesh, or maybe he does, but it's called the Kevesh Katan. So if you have a picture of it, it's the Kevesh is this very wide area of a ramp that goes all the way up to the top. You start at the bottom, go to the top, and then branching off on the Mizrahi side of the Kevesh is another Kevesh, which is called the Kevesh Katan. So that at the base of the Kevesh, you've got the Kevesh itself, which, as we said before, was 16 amos wide. And then on the right side, facing Mizrach of the Kevesh, there's another Kevesh, which is a smaller Kevesh, and that doesn't end up at the top of the Mizbeach, but it ends up at the Sovev. So if the Kohen has an avoda which he needs to perform on the Sovev, which is Malika Be'of, he will climb not the regular Kevesh, but rather the Kevesh Katan on its right, which will take you up to the Sovev. Now, if you recall, we have the Yisod, which is on the bottom, and then we have the Sovev, which is in the middle, and the Sovev will surround the Mizbeach at that height. The Kohen, from the height of the Sovev, when he climbs up from the floor, the Ritzvah Sazora up to the Sovev, that's where he's going to do the Malika Be'olas Ha'of. So therefore, Kevesh Katan Yotzei Hayim Mizracho Shel Kevesh Gadol. So it shoots off on the right side, and it's a separate ramp. It just starts at the base of the Kevesh. Uponel Yamino v'nivshach v'olav alakson ad l'sovev. So now, what you're looking at is the Sovev is going all the way around the Mizbeach. So the Kevesh will take you up on one side, but then to your right, there's a Sovev where the Kohen would walk. And from that point, he would... Now you have to understand that the Sovev, since it goes all the way around the Mizbeach, how is he going to climb up a kevesh to get that point where there's right where he's on the corner of the Mizbeach? The only way he can get to the corner of the Mizbeach through this kevesh is if the kevesh splits off from the main kevesh. I'm talking about the kevesh katan in a small angle. Let's call it we'll call it a 45-degree angle. So that's called balakson. So you've got the kevesh itself, the kevesh hagadol, and then a certain degree, again, in this case, to the right side, is a kevesh that shoots up, and it will reach that corner of the Mizbeach where the Kohen has to implement the Malikas Ha'of. So that's what he calls alakson, when it shoots off. And it reaches that sovev, right? That sovev is like a platform that juts out of the Mizbeach and surrounds the entire Mizbeach. That's where the Kohen stood, and he did the Malikas Olas Ha'of. Now, the second thing, and this is just a review of what we've discussed in the past, that is the second avodah that's performed by the Kohanim on the Sovev, is the Chatos. So we're talking about the Hazas Domim of a Korban Chatos, which is on the 4 chronos of the Mizbeach, on the top of the Mizbeach. So when the Kohen is standing on the Sovev, he can do the Hazah of a Chatos on the 4 chronos of the Mizbeach. Okay, now, is there a kevesh that will lead the Kohen from the ground of the Azar till the Yisod HaMizbech? Remember that on the Yisod HaMizbech there was what's called Shvichas Shirayim. And that's called the Kevesh Katan Liyisod. It's called the Kevesh Katan because relative to the main Kevesh, it's a small Kevesh. But we have to add the word Liyisod because this is going to be on the south side of the Kevesh, or the main Kevesh, towards the west. Upana Liyisod, the Kevesh Zeh. Now, it's very interesting. If you happen to have the diagram, what happens is this Kevesh Katan for the Yisod actually splits into 2 parts. There's one part which is exactly adjoined, contiguous to the Kevesh Gadol, and then there's a part that goes off, in this case on the left, because now we're facing the western side, and that shoots off from the Yisod. He says, "B'kevesh zeh hayu holchim hakohanim liachar yiridosam min hamizbeach shebo noslu dmei hachatos k'dei lagia liyisod lishpoch es shiori adam." So on the one hand, he needs that part of the kevesh katan of the yisod that's contiguous to the kevesh, because that he has to go up in order to perform the dmei hazod dmei chatos. But that's not enough. He needs another mitzvah on the Yisod, which is called Shvichas Shirayim, as we discussed in the past at great length. And that Shvichas Shirayim takes him to a different area in the Yisod, which is more towards the west, so that we have that split. Now we have an interesting discussion. There is, as we discussed in the past, an airspace separating between the Kevesh and the Mizbeach. We're back to the Kevesh HaGadol. What's the status of that airspace, which is called Avir Sheben Kevesh LeMizbeach? This is a sugya in Mesechtes Zvachim Adaf Samach Beis, and the Gemara has the Yalfusa from which it derives that there must be avir, there must be airspace separating the kevesh and the mizbeach. And the Gemara tells us that according to Rabbi Yossi, we derive from the pasuk v'asisa olosecha habasar v'adam, which at the face of it has nothing to do with our discussion. But he says that kishem shedam nitan bizrika, af basar nitan bizrika. In other words, when the Torah says in one breath, basar v'dam, it's teaching me a requirement of zrika in basar, which is very interesting when you think about it. You know, we've been talking all along since Kadmis Danan about zrika and dam, hazah and dam, shvicha and dam. We never discussed the basar. How does the basar get on top of the Mizbeach, the imurim that have to be burnt? And you may have drawn the conclusion that the Kohen climbs up the kevish, gets onto the maroch, and places the basar, the imurim, on top of the eish. But that's not so. What the Kohen has to do is a zrika of the basar. From whence do we derive this? Because it says v'yasisa losecha habasar v'adam, an equation between basar and dam. And just like dam requires what? Zrika, so too basar requires zrika. In other words, he says, Haya koin tzarich liten es habasar. How does the Kohen place the basar? Is it litocha eish atzma? Is he says muchach hayel lizrak habasar lemerchak litocha eish? What does he gain by zrika of the basar litocha eish? He's using human logic. He's not applying Xeris HaKosov here. Saying that the eitzim, the logs that are used as fuel to get the fuel going, will not immediately set a flame. It's going to take a little bit of a time until the flame catches. And that's called adayin lo sholta ba ha'esh. The esh is not fully burning the logs that you put on top. If you've ever made a bonfire, you know what I'm talking about. Ubekach limda haTorah bekach shezorek es habasar. So when the Torah equates basar with dam, what is the purpose of that equation? I mean, we know that the Kohen has to get the basar onto the H. I don't need an equation between basar and dam to derive that conclusion. And I know that the Kohen has to get the basar onto the H when it's sholta ba isho, when the H is sholetis by. So what did the Torah mean when it equated basar with dam? And the answer is to teach us zrikas habasar. Now, here's the main punchline. Whenever the Torah requires zrika, there's always got to be a hefsek avir. And in this case, where the Torah with regard to basar requires a zrika, then you need a hefsek avir. And therefore, we derive the conclusion that there's got to be a hefsek avir between the kevesh and the mizbeach, because since there are requirements in which the Kohen has to be zorek the basar, it must be that there's an avir that separates between the kevesh from where he's throwing and the mizbeach from where to where the the basar has to be thrown. So again, Rabbi say, just to summarize, the kevesh could not be completely contiguous to the Mizbeach without allowing for any airspace. There's got to be some space between the kevesh and the Mizbeach, because otherwise we could not understand the Torah's requirement of zrika, which we got with regard to basar of zvach. The concept of zrika, by its very nature, implies that there is a hefsek avir. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called zrika. It reminds me by sheer association of Meleches Zorik on Shabbos. I mean, Zorik means you send it flying through the air. Now, this pasuk that we learned is referring to the Kevesh HaGadol, but it matters not. Even the Kevesh HaKatan is going to require Avir, because even the Kevesh HaKatan, we said, we have an avoda called Melikas HaOf, and there too, we have halacha of Avir. Now, we're going to finish it up, but I just want to point out, here he says that there are two different reasons why there has to be a hefsek avir. One is because of the pasuk al mizbeach saviv. Ainu sheyeh hekev kolshu l'mizbeach. So that's the pasuk al mizbeach saviv. And what does that mean, saviv? Sheyeh hekev l'mizbeach. If they were mechubarim, then shuv ein adam yochel hakif es mizbeach bechut kolshu. And the second reason is mishum shekasuv ribua yeh mizbeach ve'ima yu akvashim mechubarim ein mizbeach nechshav ribua. So the second explanation is a lot easier to comprehend. It's intuitive. It's almost immediate. If the kevesh is contiguous to the mizbeach and there's no avir in between, then the mizbeach now incorporates the kevesh as well. So the surah, the entire plan for the mizbeach, includes the kevesh. If there's no avir separating the kevesh from the mizbeach, and then what you can have is that there's no ribua, because at certain, a certain section of the mizbeach, that wall, so to speak, of the mizbeach is much, much larger, and doesn't lend itself to ribua. But the first explanation, al mizbeach saviv, so it means that I see what he's saying. If I understand correctly, what he's saying is, because again, he's summarizing a whole sugya here in Zvachim in just a few words, but I think what he's saying is that the idea of a chut hasikra, which divides the mizbech into two parts, would not be smooth, it would not be glatt, as we say in Yiddish, if you were to consider that the Kodshim are attached, mechubarim, to the Mizbeach. Because once you attach the kevesh to the, and there are three of them now, right, to the Mizbeach, then imagine if you put a belt around your waist, right? So it goes, it's a perfect circle. But now we're saying that the kevesh branches off to the right side on the Mizrach for the sake of the Yisod, and on the left side for the sake of the Sovev, and on the left side for the sake of the Yisod. How are you going to wrap the Mizbeach around in a chut? Chut is the string that they use. It's like in Lahavdil in a swimming pool. They have a rope and says, here's the deep water, right? So you need that rope, the sikra, the chut sikra around the Mizbeach to separate from the top half of the Mizbeach and the bottom half of the Mizbeach. And it's a chut that goes around smoothly, as opposed to having to wrap around the kvoshim. The kevesh cut on here and the kevesh cut on here. So that indicates that we have an avir that separates the mizbeach from the kevesh. So the chut will go around the mizbeach underneath that avir, if you follow me. Okay, that's as far as that's concerned.